across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Wednesday edition of Point of View. And first half hour, we're going to talk about how the media and even a number of other people dealt with the 4th of July, and in particular, this 250th anniversary. And I thought it would be appropriate to put out a piece on the media's not-so-happy 4th of July, but then also to focus a little bit of time and attention on a speech given by Zohran Mamdani. I've got two pieces, one by our friend Cal Thomas, one by, of course, Victor Davis Hanson. Both have been on the program with us before. And then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to spend some time talking about Christian martyrs. In particular, we'll have our friend Todd Nettleton with Voice of the Martyrs. We'll talk about the Day of the Christian Martyr, which is coming up here in July, and when to talk more about that. Actually, it was commemorated in June. I'm ahead of myself here. Already has happened, but it's still something we can talk about, as well as just the plight of persecuted Christians around the world. Second hour, we're going to get into some of the reports that have come out about how the Trump administration has made a fair amount of money, including the family, and how that has become kind of an issue as well. And, of course, we'll get into some other topics related to the rise of socialism. Just as a program note, I might just mention that the August issue of Outlook, which has not been mailed yet, so don't be looking for it quite yet, but you'll be seeing it soon, is on the rise of socialism. I'll hold up a sample copy here. And, of course, we talked about the February issue on that subject as well. We know that is going to be a topic for some time. We are fully prepared and will continue to help prepare you for how to address some of those very important issues. So that's for today. Tomorrow, we have a number of guests lined up as well, including a great interview on the book, or actually I should say the movie, Great Awakening, although there are some books related to that as well, and some other interviews that I think you'll appreciate. Friday, of course, we have our weekend edition, so each day we will be covering some very important issues, and a little bit later, of course, if you'd like to join us, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join this conversation. But this one by Brittany Bernstein is entitled The Media's Not So Happy 4th of July. Now, I'll be honest, I don't, especially over the weekend, and especially when it was 4th of July, probably spent more time watching a soccer game or just enjoying the weekend, and didn't take a lot of time to watch some of the other press. But I remember seeing a piece that showed up on YouTube from Glenn Beck, in which he was talking about how can you find anything else to criticize, because he was talking about how the Washington Post and MS Now and a number of others were criticizing Trump for shooting off fireworks. And as Brittany points out, it is hard to imagine anybody complaining about that if anyone else other than Donald Trump was president. So that was part of it. And of course, the argument being made from some of these individuals is the current president, Donald Trump, ruined the 4th of July. And I'll just give you a few quotes just so that you know I'm not making this up. The opinion writer for New York Times, Robert Givhan, actually said, Trump ruined the 4th of July for me. Barely tolerated the sight of red, white, and blue this year when combined into the display of nationalist cheerleading. The colors made my heart ache. The flags on the federal building are grand, but they hang alongside banners of Donald Trump. Now, just to maybe put this in perspective, this was the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I'm old enough to remember the 200th anniversary, which was called the Bicentennial. Who was president there? Well, that was Gerald Ford. Now, he may not have been exactly the most popular president because he had, just before that, actually pardoned Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon was not well liked, and Watergate was the scandal, and yet nobody really got upset about that. Quite frankly, a few months later, if you add to that, you then have the election of Jimmy Carter. And quite frankly, you can say right now that if the roles were reversed, and let's say that Joe Biden won re-election, Kamala Harris won re-election, or Barack Obama didn't run and actually would then be running in his second term now. There come up with some hypotheticals there. Would you get the sense that people in the so-called conservative media would talk about how awful this was? And I think you know the answer to that. It's not the case. Here, again, she talks about how the former NBC host, I guess I should say, Chuck Todd, made Trump sound like the Grinch of the 4th of July. NBC said, rather than not fly the flag, we're telling people maybe to fly the flag upside down. And on and on and on. And so then what I think was even more disturbing to me is, for example, to see some of the questions being asked about this in a historical point of view. And this goes into the fact that we do have checks and balances in the Federalist Papers, and that these checks and balances somehow are not working. I'd remind them that a good number of cases that Donald Trump hoped to win in front of the Supreme Court lost. Many of the things that Donald Trump tried to push through Congress, including, as we'll talk about this in the next hour, some very significant issues, just language in the United States Senate. But nevertheless, that's the kind of argument being made. But one other one that really bothered me, and I'm glad she mentioned that, because I did see a video of this. John Meacham is a historian of some note, and I depend on some of these individuals, even though they don't have a Christian conviction. It is important to recognize that many of these historians have looked at our country, given us some perspective, aren't necessarily looking through their particular view through Christian glasses. And so John Meacham is one of those individuals that I quote from time to time. And he made this argument the other day, and it still just is a head scratcher, in which he says there really is no anniversary to celebrate in 2026, because a very good case could be made that the country was actually founded in 1965. And when he said that, I thought, what? He goes on to explain, well, that's when we had a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy came into being with the Immigration and Nationality Act, along with the Voter Rights Act. By the way, Civil Rights Act was the year before. But nevertheless, to say that America really didn't exist until Lyndon Johnson and his force of nature was able to push through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, later the Immigration and Nationality Act, and then you can actually consider America a country. It is a sad, sad commentary indeed, and that is the kind of rhetoric that is now being thrown around. And so when we come back from the break, I do want to spend just a little bit of time quoting both from Cal Thomas and Victor Davis Hanson, who I think did a very good job of analyzing this rant that came from the mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani. But nevertheless, to complain about the environmental impact of fireworks, as she points out, these articles would never have been written had any other president been in office during those displays. And I think we know the answer to that. And talking about Trump derangement syndrome, it has certainly affected not only many of the people in the media, but even some eminent historians. And there's a need to get a little bit more perspective and balance, and we'll see if we can see if Cal Thomas and Victor Davis Hanson can provide that after we take a break. Well, let's take a break. We'll come back and then spend some more time later on moving on to other very important topics in the news. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The editors of the Wall Street Journal ask, do Bible passages belong in English class? Texas is the reason for the question. Back in April, the Texas State Board of Education gave preliminary approval to a set of reading lists that included some Bible excerpts. Those Bible passages were approved just a week ago by a slim margin. Apparently, even mentioning the Bible in public schools has become controversial. The linked article to the Wall Street Journal provides some needed perspective. For example, there's the 23rd Psalm reference to, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." That passage has been repeated by everyone from Nelson Mandela to a recent rapper. They mention a passage in Ecclesiastes, to everything there's a season, it says, including a time to be born and a time to die. They point out this wasn't a lyric written by the Byrds in 1965. That passage is found in the Bible, which the Supreme Court says is constitutional if taught in an objective manner. Here are a few of the other Bible passages. Love is patient and kind in 1 Corinthians 13. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, Matthew 5. The editors remind us that those passages can be found in secular literature, such as the works by Walt Whitman, Charles Dickens, Robert Frost, and George Orwell. When we were discussing this on my radio broadcast, I argued that you couldn't even begin to understand many of the references and allusions used in English literature if you didn't have some understanding of the Bible. Given the level of biblical literacy today, including some Bible passages within an English class makes sense. Fortunately, the Texas State Board made the right decision, but the vote was closer than it should have been. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if we can, for just a few minutes, talk about this rant by the mayor of New York City. I've wondered about this. Sometimes I debate among myself, should we even cover this? After all, it's past history, and everybody has a right to their own opinion. They don't have a right to their own facts, but it is important because in some respects, this message by the mayor of New York City, who is one of the leaders in the Democratic Socialist Party, is something that's going to be around for some time. And after all, even though the 4th of July is in the rearview mirror, this whole year is a celebration of 250 years. We're going to hear more of this, so it's worth just a mention or two and some comments from Cal Thomas and Victor Davis Hanson. Cal Thomas says the New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani delivered a 4th of July message that sounded like America is on its deathbed. Immigrant citizens standing on each side of him as he sat at the desk used, by the way, this is another reason to talk about this. He sat at the desk that was used by George Washington. Remember, our capital used to be in New York City before we, of course, established it in Washington, D.C. And he says the 4th of July is supposed to be a celebratory time, but not for Mamdani, who looked like he'd lost his best friend. Well, let's take a quote or two. Here he says, after some obligatory praise, then Mamdani said, the powerful, that the America is really for the powerful. America is an arena of supremacy where only a select few are allowed freedom, where not all are created equal. And I appreciate Cal Thomas, who is probably less likely to mince words than many. He said that's a total blatant lie. America has a history of trying to right wrongs and prove the opposite of his claim, as in civil rights legislation, which we just talked about, court rulings, and things even the election of Barack Obama, even Zohran Mamdani, and the rest. And so the argument is he said, well, they're really trying to divide us. And I thought, no, that's actually kind of the playbook in some respects of the Democratic Socialist of America. You'll see that quote again in just a minute when we get to Victor Davis Hanson's evaluation. And so he then talks about the fact that we have a nation that's full of contradictions. We're the wealthiest nation and children go to sleep hungry. And he's, of course, talking about the environment he's in. And Cal Thomas reminds him and us that Democrats have held the mayor's office in New York City for years. We've also had Democratic presidents. Why haven't they fixed the problem? There is always this tendency to blame America, to blame politicians, when many of those politicians are the ones who could have fixed them. I mean, when you hear Bernie Sanders talk about the problems with our government and the problems of wealth inequality when he has been in Congress for decade after decade after decade, sometimes you have to say, Zohran Mamdani can certainly say, well, I'm new to the game, but there were other people that were in the game for a long time and nothing has really changed. Which, of course, leads me to the next point, because then Zohran Mamdani criticized oligarchs who sell our elections to the highest bidder. Cal Thomas reminds him, somehow you seem to ignore George Soros, his spending on U.S. elections. The latest estimates are that George Soros has spent more than $100 million in just the current midterm election cycle, making him the largest individual political donor to date. And so, again, when you have these claims being made, there's no sense of irony, no sense of hypocrisy, just a simple argument that we have a nation run by oligarchs. And, we can complain about the amount of money in elections, but it's amazing how they always seem to turn a blind eye to the money that allowed them to get elected as well. Well, Victor Davis Hanson says, let me take on a couple other things that were said by Zohran Mamdani. Mamdani said, America, they will tell you, belongs only to those with the right accent or the right shade of skin. The rest of us, they insist, should be grateful for being allowed to visit. Playing the victim is amazing. How small they are, how weak, how unoriginal. At every moment in our past, those who led through exclusion and isolation have tried to win power and enrich themselves by turning us against one another. Again, those are the phrases, not from Victor Davis Hanson, not from me, but from, of course, Zohran Mamdani. So what does Victor Davis Hanson say about that? Well, he says this is spoken by a rich, pampered kid from Uganda who immigrated to America with his now endowed professor father and elite filmmaker mother, the latter reportedly supported by millions of dollars in grants from the Qatari royal autocracy. Upon arriving, the Mamdanis joined what is statistically America's wealthiest and most highly credentialed ethnic group, the enormously privileged Indian American community. And so he says, why does this Nepo baby somehow include himself as the victimized rest of us? I mean, has he really been victimized that much? He says, should we laugh or cry when he talks about how he's been victimized when he has lived a very privileged life? Are there some that haven't? Certainly that is the case, but when it's the rest of us, you can see the problem. He says, then again, if Zohran Mamdani wishes to invoke the tired Marxist oppressor binary, how small they are versus the rest of us, then by his own revolutionary vocabulary, he once belonged to, I love this line from Victor Davis Hanson, the settler colonial Indian expatriate elite. But he says, look, I would argue that America has asked nothing of the Mamdanis, much less demanded gratitude from a family whose books, films, and activism have consistently reflected anti-Americanism. And if you're not familiar with the Mamdani family, that's a quick summary of what has been there. And so again, one of the things that Victor Davis Hanson asked of Zohran Mamdani is, does he think there is less opportunity but more oppression, more misogyny, more religious and racial intolerance in America than, say, in Uganda or India? Uganda, from which they immigrated, India, from which their nationality is. Americans welcome, he says, more immigrants each year than any other nation, and they have long admired legal immigrants who enrich the country by assimilating, acculturating, and integrating, not by carving out near permanent ethnic enclaves. Yet, he points out, Americans are understandably astonished when recent immigrants from failed states, plagued by caste prejudice and dictatorship, find themselves actually talking about such issues as religious intolerance or endemic racism when the countries from which they came actually do practice that. And when you are talking about poverty, when they've come in some cases from countries that have what he calls Marxist-induced poverty, and of course places where there is rampant anti-Semitism, systemic violence, misogyny, homophobia, and they begin to lecture America on America's supposed shortcomings. So if nothing else, I think it is a really good antidote to some of the part of that speech that was given by Zoran Mamdani. But Victor Davis Hanson goes on to mention just a few other things. Can Zoran Mamdani explain why this supposedly racist and nativist America has since the mid-1960s admitted millions of immigrants, the overwhelming majority of them non-white, if indeed America is supposedly so systemic, xenophobic, and racist? That's a good question. He says if America is as hostile towards people of Indian ancestry as Mamdani alleges, why have some of the 5.4 million Indians immigrated here, making them one of the nation's largest and fastest growing foreign-born populations? As for, as he points out, America's past sins, Victor Davis Hanson says, some 165 years ago, 700,000 mostly white Americans slaughtered one another in a war to abolish slavery, an ancient and evil institution that had brought 10 times as many Africans to Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Latin America than to American South, while the more than 15 million others were sent into the Muslim world through slave trades facilitated by African rulers who sold tribal tribes into bondage. Goes on to give you some other arguments, but if nothing else, it's just a good antidote to certainly a rant or an embittered kind of complain about America and this idea of victimhood. And again, this was a 4th of July speech, and that's in the rearview mirror, but I don't think this is the only time we're going to hear some of these kinds of claims and comments, which is why if you go to our website, pointofview.net, we've posted both the article by Cal Thomas and the one by Victor Davis Hanson. I would encourage you to read it in its entirety, maybe pass it on to others. Use it effectively, as we're going to hear more and more of these kind of arguments against America in the 250-year celebration of the Declaration of Independence. Let's take a break. I'm going to talk now with our friend Todd Nettleton about the Day of the Christian Martyr. All that coming up right after this.
There are so many big stories happening literally everywhere. So much information, documents released, grand jury testimony, political accusations and claims on all sides. How in the world can any of us keep up? How do we weed out the truly important from the merely sensational? None of us can do it alone. I've been in media for more than 45 years. I've trained my skills, and yet even with that, I am glad for the more than 50-year track record of the team here at Point of View. They help us to cut through the noise and focus on the authentically important. More than that, biblically informed eyes to help us understand and develop ways to respond effectively. Providing what we need takes time and resources, and your partnership makes it all possible. Click on into pointofview.net, hit the donate button, or call 1-800-347-5151. Please give today. Better, sign up and help monthly. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, one of the things we talk about so often is the plight of persecuted Christians, and one of the individuals we love to go to is Todd Nettleton, who's Vice President for Message for the Voice of Martyrs, and again, also the host of the Voice of Martyrs Radio. Traveled the world, conducted face-to-face interviews. We're going to talk about the Day of the Christian Martyr, which was commemorated last month, and also some of the things happening around the world. So, Todd, thank you once again for joining us here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
We do have a link to the website here, as we always do, and you can go to the website, the newly constructed website, pointofview.net, and find your way there to Voice of the Martyrs. Of course, you can also just go directly to their website as well. Either way is going to be helpful, persecution.com. Talk about the Day of the Christian Martyr. That was something I was unfamiliar with, and that's one of the ways we wanted to educate people today.
Yeah, June 29th, Day of the Christian Martyr, and many listeners will say, well, why June 29th? That, according to church historians, is the date that the Apostle Paul was beheaded outside the city of Rome. So it has become Day of the Christian Martyr, where we really honor people like Paul who laid down their lives for Christ. Here at Voice of the Martyrs, we make some resources available every year. We focus on one story of someone who gave their lives for Christ. In years past, it has sometimes been somebody who died quite recently, and maybe somebody that nobody's really heard of. This year, we looked back almost 2,000 years to Perpetua, somebody a lot of us have heard of, who was killed in Carthage, ancient Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, killed in a Roman arena there because she wouldn't offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. She wouldn't pray to the emperor. She said, I am a Christian. I can't do that. And because of that, she gave her life.
Well, again, this is something where her father told her to compromise, and of course there was just a number of other issues. And again, this was in 200 plus AD, at a time when we were thinking that eventually some of that kind of persecution was ending, but there nevertheless is the case. So you do have some resources. I believe you have a video, and so this might be something, obviously it's in the past, but it's something that people might want to implement into their church calendars. So talk about where they could find that information and begin to apply it maybe even next year, or use it when we do have a time in which we once again honor the persecuted Christians come fall.
Well, you mentioned persecution.com. That is the main Voice of the Martyrs website. If you add /martyr, persecution.com/martyr, you will find all of the Day of the Christian Martyr resources. And, you know, June 29th has passed, but if you're a leader, if you're a pastor, if you're a Sunday school teacher, you could show that 2.5-minute video in your class this week and just ask the question, hey, Perpetua gave her life to see the gospel advance. What would you give? What would you sacrifice? I think whether you're in a youth group or an adult Sunday school class, you could have quite a discussion just around that topic of, hey, what would we sacrifice? And I think that's a great question for us as American believers. What are we willing to sacrifice to see our communities reached with the gospel?
Let me just again mention that it's persecution.com/martyr. If you go there, you'll see a nice diagram of Perpetua. There is a video that you can watch that is a YouTube video that you can find. Scroll down, you'll find some free resources, digital resource kit, and a variety of others, and also why this particular day tied into the martyrdom of the Apostle Paul. So if you find yourself saying, okay, I already went to Voice of the Martyrs, and all I have to do is click on one other button and I will find it there. So great resources, always a helpful reminder of the fact that though we enjoy tremendous freedom in this country and in a lot of Western countries, as we move around the world, we see something different. And one of the things you were nice enough to pass on to my producer, Steve, was to maybe talk about a few of those, because I oftentimes just pick the ones that interest me, but it's always nice to know which ones you're talking about. And so let's talk about China. That has been in the news. We have done an Outlook, a magazine on China in terms of the potential threats militarily. We've talked about the situation certainly with believers in that country, but in some respects you have some good news and some bad news, don't you?
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. Good news is there is a pastor, a man named Ezra Jin, who was released from prison last weekend. Actually, not only released from a Chinese prison, but then put on a plane to America,
yes,
where his family already was. So he's been released from prison, reunited with his family, and set free to come to America. That is incredibly good news. This is a success story for the Trump administration. When President Trump was in Beijing in May, in meeting with President Xi Jinping of China, he specifically mentioned Pastor Ezra Jin. And Xi Jinping said, well, I don't know, I'll look into it. Well, apparently he looked into it, and it's good news. They said they actually tied this release to our 250th anniversary. So saying, hey, happy birthday, America. In honor of that, we're going to free this pastor. That's the good news. That's great news. Praise the Lord for that. The bad news is there are still 8 leaders from Zion Church, his Pastor Ezra Jin's church, who are in custody in China. They are still facing charges. Interestingly, and this has been the pattern for the communist government about the last 2 years, the charges against them are fraud and illegal business practices. So not illegal religious gatherings, not a religious charge, but fraud and illegal business practices. And the reason they do that is if you or I call the embassy, they will say, oh, no, we're not persecuting any Christians.
Yeah.
We're cracking down on fraud. We're protecting consumers. The other thing is it is very difficult for these leaders who have collected tithes and offerings for a church that doesn't legally exist. So the government says, hey, you committed fraud. You took an offering for a church that doesn't exist. And you say, well, no, my church exists. We meet every week. Well, show us your paperwork. Show us your bank account. Show us what, how do you say you have a church? They cannot do that because the government refuses to register them. So it allows the communist government to hide the persecution. It makes it very hard for the Christians to defend themselves. And that has been the tactic against church leaders for, like I say, about the last 2 years. All of the charges have been financial crimes, not religious crimes.
Well, again, that's something to mention because as people maybe do express their opinions about this, and we've had guests on this program that have talked about calling the embassy and the rest, you can see that if you're using financial issues, it puts it in a different category. And so, again, you've been following, of course, the individuals in, again, Ezra Zin's Zion Church, but also I know you've been following something else, what's called the Early Rain Covenant Church?
Yeah, this is another church that has been under heavy persecution in China since 2018. In fact, their pastor, Pastor Wang Yi, was arrested at the end of 2018. He is serving a 9-year prison sentence right now. Their church is still meeting, and it's interesting. They have agreed. They hold a lot of things online. They try to avoid, sort of sticking their thumb in the eye of the government, but they refuse to give up gathering together, and they try at least once a month to have a service in person where they can serve communion. And in June, that service was held 100 miles from their hometown. So they drove 100 miles to try to avoid police attention to have that communion service. Somehow the police knew about it. They sent in 60 to 70 officers, including religious affairs officials, including a SWAT team, like they were fighting some terrorists, and broke up this communion service. Initially, they detained 30-plus members of the church. By the end of the day, they had interrogated and released most of them, but the 2 leaders of the service are still in custody. We're still waiting to hear what the charges are against them. But again, this is a long time process that this church has gone through. They have been under intense pressure for 6, 7, 8 years now, and they still are meeting together. They are still standing strong in their faith, and they are suffering greatly. And that is the story of the Chinese church right now. The communist government is determined to control the church. Any church that will not bend its knee to the Communist Party is being harassed and persecuted, and leaders are arrested, and services are broken up. Just what we're seeing with Early Rain Covenant Church.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about a few other particular countries around the world. And if you want during the break to go to the website, persecution.com, that's for the Voice of the Martyrs. There's a place where you can get the free magazine. Of course, we've already talked about some of the resources for this Day of the Christian Martyr. There's a place where you can donate and all sorts of other resources that you can find about that. There's a global prayer guide that I might point you to to as well. And of course, we oftentimes talk about the circumstances in some of these countries. We've been talking about China when we come back. The one that was a real surprise a couple of years ago when you had Voice of the Martyrs and even Open Doors talking about India. This one isn't so much anti-religion per se. It's anti-Christian because of a nationalist government. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about, of course, a few of these situations in many of these Muslim countries, because the greatest persecution today, seemingly outside of course, communist China, is with these Muslim countries. And so we'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Todd Nettleton with us for a few more minutes. Again, Vice President for Message for the Voice of the Martyrs. You can go to the website, persecution.com. And Todd, one of the things that surprised many of us a few years ago is when you would look at the list of places where there's the greatest persecution. Not surprised that we see North Korea, we see China, we see many Muslim countries. But the one that popped up on the list was India. It isn't necessarily anti-religion, as rather it is sort of a nationalist, a Hindu nationalist government. And now they're restricting even more so the money that flows in there, which then would not allow for missionaries, whether they're official or unofficial, whether they're NGOs or something else, to be used for conversion activities. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, as you mentioned, this is a Hindu nationalist government, Prime Minister Modi. Now, India brags about being the world's largest democracy. That is true. This is a government that was elected by the Indian people, but there are literally government ministers who have talked about the soil of India is Hindu soil. And if you are not a Hindu, this is really not your place. You don't really belong here. So now you have the government modifying what they call the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or FCRA. This governs how money comes into India from outside for nonprofit organizations. And in the last few years, they have tightened these controls and tightened. And now they have said that all of this money needs to come through one bank that the government can watch and see where the money's coming from. Now they are saying none of this money can be used for proselytizing, for conversion-related activities. Well, you know, what does that look like? You know, one of the things that has happened as India has tightened these controls is you've had ministries, I think particularly of Compassion International, they left India completely because of these government controls getting tighter and tighter about, can we get money in? What can we do with it? Now the government is saying no conversion activities. They are also saying, before we release these funds to your NGO, we need to know what you're going to do with it and where. So you need to get pre-approval on your ministry activities before they will release any money that's coming into the country. So it is a tool that the Indian government is using, and they are really tightening the screws on Christian NGOs that might be involved in sharing the gospel.
Again, world's largest democracy, but also one that has got a very definite anti-Christian, anti-religion other than Hindu bias to it as well. Well, in the few minutes left, I thought we might talk about some of the Muslim countries, and I know you have a story about Kazakhstan, but also did an interview with a widow from a pastor from Turkmenistan.
Yeah, we just had it, and I would so encourage people, find Voice of the Martyrs Radio wherever you listen to podcasts, and find our interview with Sister Maya. Sister Maya is the widow of a pastor from Turkmenistan. She tells the story of her husband coming to Christ. He was not a good guy, and he came to Christ, and she saw a radical change in him. But it took 6 years for her to come to Christ. She wasn't completely sure. She didn't really, is this real? Is he going to do this forever? Finally, she was convinced her husband was truly a new creation, and she chose to follow Christ as well. Here's the interesting part of the story, and I think it points to something we can do as American Christians to bless persecuted Christians. Her husband was arrested in Turkmenistan, was sent to prison. We had him on a website that Voice of the Martyrs has called prisoneralert.com. It is a website to help you write letters to Christians in prison. Interestingly, her husband never got to see the letters. And I actually, when I interviewed her, I pulled up the website and said, look, this is the page. This is where a lot of those letters came from. He never got to see them. He never got to read them. But one of the cleaning staff at the prison said, sir, you're getting a lot of letters you're getting letters from America and from Canada and from the United Kingdom. Who do you know all over the world? I don't understand it. How are you getting all these letters? And he knew that he was not forgotten. He knew that Christians were praying for him. He knew that he was not alone in that prison cell. And she said, what an incredible encouragement that was to him. The other thing that happened, his prison sentence was 4 years, but he was released after a little less than 2 years. So not only did he get encouragement in prison, he also ended up being released early. And she thinks part of that is because they thought, hey, this guy's got friends all over the world. People are watching this case. Let's go ahead and get him out of prison and let's kind of make this story go away. He has since he died of an illness. He's gone on to glory. She is still serving the Lord, doing women's ministry in Turkmenistan. But again, I would just encourage people. One of the things I said, hey, some of the people who wrote those letters are going to be listening to this Voice of the Martyrs radio episode. Talk to them. And she just said, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for not forgetting us when we were in trouble.
And again, I think this illustrates, Todd, only so well that sometimes when we make an issue out of something, of course, we mentioned a minute ago, President Trump talking about Pastor Ezra Jin right there in front of course, the various leaders in Beijing, including Xi Jinping. And then here, this prisoner alert. And again, people can go to prisoneralert.com and see this situation because as we have some of these pastors that we've just talked about, one of which was Wang Yi, as well as the other, I think it was 8 individuals that were part of Pastor Jin's Zion Church. So there are some opportunities for you to learn more and also to express your opinion about that. And in so doing, you might begin to release them or lower their particular sentencing.
It really does make a difference when these oppressive governments know that the world is paying attention, because they think, hey, we can get away with this. Nobody cares about this, this pastor from this village in way out of nowhere. But when they start getting mail from around the world, it's like, wait a minute, people do care about this pastor. We better make sure he gets enough to eat. We better make sure he doesn't get beaten in prison and die on us, because then it's really going to cause trouble. So it really does make a difference. We want people to pray. Sometimes we get to actually put feet to our prayers, and prisoneralert.com is one way to do that.
So again, they can go to the website, persecution.com. There's an opportunity to get the free magazine. There's some videos that we've mentioned. Of course, just a few minutes ago, we mentioned also this very important opportunity of the Day of the Christian Martyr, which you could still maybe even talk about this Sunday, and if nothing else, plan for June 29th next year. So just all sorts of resources. And Todd, thank you for always being there. Thank you for producing the Voice of the Martyrs radio program, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It has been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's, if we can, take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some other issues. Let me mention real quickly that we also have My Viewpoints commentary today, and I might just mention that it has to do with the real question of, is it possible to have Bible passages in public school? And we will probably come back to that conversation on Friday. We will have Nathan Shackelford with us. We will have Jordan Lawrence with us. But if you would like to find out more about this, it has to do with the fact that there was a very significant issue before the Texas State Board of Education, and there was some kind of tentative approval to that, which then kind of blew up into a full-blown hearing. And I give you some examples of how it wouldn't really be that controversial to quote some of these Bible passages, whether it's the 23rd Psalm, whether it's from the book of Ecclesiastes, whether it's from 1 Corinthians 13, passages that any educated person should know. And do they belong in an English class? Well, when the English literature that you're reading quotes them, and given the level of biblical illiteracy among the younger generation, I think it'd be really appropriate to talk about the fact that these verses actually come from the Bible and what they meant at the time and how they relate to that particular piece of literature. Anyway, you can read my commentary. We're going to take a break and come back with more right after this.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now. Or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to talk about some things that are concerning, which have come as a result of the 927-page financial disclosure from President Donald Trump. But before we even get to some of those details, there's a broader issue there as well, and that is sometimes when we open up the phones, people say, well, politicians are all the same. And you know what? I'm the first to agree that there has been, over these years, a uniparty where Republicans and Democrats oftentimes pretend to oppose each other, but on a lot of issues pretty much are the same. There's another way to look at this, and Liberty, who was with us the other day, talked about the horseshoe theory of politics. Now, what did she mean by that? And this is in the first article by Andy Kessler, and that is the fact that oftentimes when we draw this on a board, we have, for example, on the left-hand side, liberals, progressives, even Marxists. On the right-hand side of the board, we have conservatives and libertarians, and so we see it as a straight line. But a lot of people have said, you know what, the two ends sort of come around and touch each other, and so that, I think, illustrates the point that this first article that I'm going to talk about, Different Parties, Same Folly, is certainly trying to illustrate. Now, we don't want to overplay that because people say, well, there's no difference between one party and the other. Well, there are some differences, and as a matter of fact, not all politicians are the same. We've interviewed some very quality individuals on the program, but the sad reality is that even though the current president, ran against the swamp, there's been a lot of swampy things happening there in his administration as well. And if you don't believe that, I would encourage you to just take the time and read this 4-page article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal by Andy Kessler, which has the title Different Parties, Same Folly. He starts out by talking about the comedian Adam Carolla, who has a routine about how very wealthy and very poor people do the same thing. Now, he says some of the printable examples, they never eat at Outback Steakhouse, they take outdoor showers, have lunch with Bono, drive a make of car that no longer exists. But the point he says is, and I won't get into all the others that are a little more questionable and wouldn't say on radio anyway, is very true about politicians. They end up doing the same things. The horseshoe theory of politics becomes reality. The left and right, progressives and MAGA, bend around and almost touch. He says, to me, it's more like a teething ring going round and round in a politician's mouth. So you might say, okay, prove your point, Andy Kessler. He says, okay, who said this? Today I'm announcing new tariffs on key sectors of the economy that are going to ensure that our workers are not held back by unfair trade practices. They include a 25% tariff on Chinese steel, aluminum products, 100% tariff on electric vehicles made in China, 25% tariff on electric vehicle batteries from China, and a 25% tariff on critical minerals that make those batteries. Who said that? Nope, not Donald Trump. That was Joe Biden. Joe Biden said that May 2024. Now, to complete the cycle, just remember, not so long ago, what did Donald Trump say? Well, tariff man, elective at midnight will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles. And as he says, clang goes the horseshoe. Okay, let's take a different one. Joe Biden. Too many corporations in America ripping people off, price gouging, junk fees, greedflation, shrinkflation. Okay, that was Joe Biden. What, Donald Trump? Oh, customers are being gouged. Gasoline prices better start going down a lot faster than what I'm seeing, and you have that. The one that we talked about the other day, which is of concern, Bernie Sanders for some time has talked about the fact that he wanted government to own 50% of AI companies, artificial intelligence companies. And so then Andy Kessler says, well, get in line, Bernie, because just the other day, you had the vice president, J.D. Vance, said the president is supportive of the U.S. owning these big AI companies. The president has said it. The vice president, J.D. Vance, has said that. And AI is even considering giving up a percentage, OpenAI giving up a percentage to Washington. On top of that, you already have the investments the government has made, U.S. Steel, Intel, and the rest. Can we get somebody in the White House that really believes in a free market and doesn't believe in, this would be a good definition of what I think most of us would call true fascism. Fascism, where government doesn't control the means of production, but it owns some of the means of production, is the case. Here's a couple more. Presidential powers. Remember Barack Obama? I've got a pen, I've got a phone, right? Remember that? And we criticized that. I think it was a legitimate criticism. Well, last month you had the same thing. Donald Trump said, I'm president and you're not. Executive orders aren't laws. Only Congress can pass laws. And some of these executive orders have been struck down because, as we even mentioned the other day with Michael Ferris, he said, I was pretty sure the executive order on birthright citizenship would be struck down, not because there might not be a case for reevaluating the 14th Amendment, but executive order was not the way to do it. There you go. And nobody's going to, I think, question the conservative credentials of Michael Ferris. But nevertheless, you can see these kinds of things coming down. A couple others real quickly. I think you can get the point by now that the Biden administration put limits on AI chip exports. Of course, the other day, President Trump put licensing requirements on high-end processors, but allowed some exports of some of these chips. And so, again, you just kind of see more and more similarities. And this is part of why we say we're not just concerned about the deep state, and I've got a booklet on a biblical point of view on the deep state. We're concerned about the fact that sometimes when people get into power, the use of that power begins to be something that is why the framers of the Constitution, especially James Madison, wanted to have checks and balances. And so, again, Andy Kessler ends by saying, look, okay, Democrats and Republicans do have differences. Oftentimes it's Venus and Mars kinds of things on taxes or free speech or something like that. But unfortunately, sometimes when it comes to family, and that's what we're going to talk about after the break, that is the case. We were, I think, legitimately concerned when Hunter Biden was being paid $1 million a year by Ukraine's Burisma Holdings. He came with no discernible expertise at all, and now we have a new mining deal for tungsten extraction in Kazakhstan, and this involves both of the sons of Donald Trump, both Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's offspring in some of those deals. And so again, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the fact that not only the Trump family, but people in the Trump administration are cutting some of the same kinds of deals that we were legitimately criticizing here on Point of View about the Biden administration. If we're going to play it fair, we need to do so. And I think it's also instructive of the fact that if we're going to have Peter Schweitzer on to talk about some of the scandals under the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration, I got a feeling that Peter Schweitzer is going to write a book in the future, maybe even writing it right now, about the Trump administration. So we're going to talk about that after the break and then open up the phones for your comments. Let's take a break, though, and get to the second article that comes from the editorial writers of the Wall Street Journal. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The editors of the Wall Street Journal ask, do Bible passages belong in English class? Texas is the reason for the question. Back in April, the Texas State Board of Education gave preliminary approval to a set of reading lists that included some Bible excerpts. Those Bible passages were approved just a week ago by a slim margin. Apparently, even mentioning the Bible in public schools has become controversial. The linked article to the Wall Street Journal provides some needed perspective. For example, there's the 23rd Psalm reference to, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." That passage has been repeated by everyone from Nelson Mandela to a recent rapper. They mention a passage in Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season," it says, including a time to be born and a time to die. They point out this wasn't a lyric written by the Byrds in 1965. That passage is found in the Bible, which the Supreme Court says is constitutional if taught in an objective manner. Here are a few of the other Bible passages. Love is patient and kind in 1 Corinthians 13. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, Matthew 5. The editors remind us that those passages can be found in secular literature, such as the works by Walt Whitman, Charles Dickens, Robert Frost, and George Orwell. When we were discussing this on my radio broadcast, I argued that you couldn't even begin to understand many of the references and allusions used in English literature if you didn't have some understanding of the Bible. Given the level of biblical literacy today, including some Bible passages within an English class makes sense. Fortunately, the Texas State Board made the right decision, but the vote was closer than it should have been. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the articles I've posted for you to read comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, and it has the title, "The Trump Family and Honest Graft." I'll get into that second point in just a minute, but the editors say Americans tell pollsters that they don't think they are getting ahead financially. But President Trump and his family are having no trouble judging from his 2025 financial disclosure, which was released just 2 days ago on Tuesday. Now, if if you look at that, and it's not for the faint-hearted, it's 927 pages, but the 927-page report, which is, again, the financial disclosure report of Donald Trump and his family, shows that Donald Trump made $1.4 billion last year from crypto alone. The editors of the Wall Street Journal put, "Yowzers! This includes $635 million in royalties from the meme coin that Donald Trump launched days before his inauguration." Do you remember the Trump coin? Maybe you remember the Melania coin. Well, I do. And as for, and by the way, both of those went to nothing almost, and in a sense were a rug pull from the president on mostly his own donors, his own supporters. I mean, the people most likely to buy a Trump coin are not people that don't like Trump. They're people that do like Trump. And then to watch that go to essentially, it's not quite zero, but essentially, he's rug pulled his own people, which is amazing. I've never seen that before. But back to the bigger issue here. If you're watching legislation, which I have been watching, a number of years ago and then even a couple of months ago, we have had some legislation dealing with what's called cryptocurrency. One of those which has passed, which is called the Genius Act, that dealt primarily with stable coins. We now have what is called the Clarity Act. It passed the House, but it's having difficulty passing in the Senate. Why? Because, of course, in order to break filibuster, to actually get cloture, you need to come up with at least 7 Democrats that would vote to actually bring about a vote on the Clarity Act. And this $1.4 billion that Donald Trump and his family made on crypto gave, I hate to be honest, Elizabeth Warren 1.4 billion reasons why not to pass the Clarity Act. Something which would have helped provide some clarity, by the way, for digital tokens and things of that nature. We've talked about Bitcoin, and there's other kind of cryptos there as well. But this again, 927-page report illustrates that only so well. And so, again, I don't think there's much of a chance of the Clarity Act being passed. And a couple of months ago, we even thought about doing an Outlook magazine on the issue of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and those kinds of things. And I said, well, I don't think we want to do it until the Clarity Act passes. And I don't think that's going to happen. And I think one of the good reasons is Donald Trump and his family have given Elizabeth Warren and all sorts of other people like that, Bernie Sanders and the rest, 1.4 billion reasons why not. But that's not the only thing, because the editors of the Wall Street Journal go on and point out that $593 billion came from token and equity sales by, again, World Liberty Financial. Who are the founders of that? Well, that'd be the president and his 2 sons. That would be, of course, Donald Jr. and Eric Trump, as well as the special envoy, Steve Witkoff. Okay, let's start thinking that through. Steve Witkoff, have you seen what he's been doing lately? Well, he's been actually negotiating some of these trade deals, being sent to negotiate a ceasefire with Iran. And Mr. Witkoff, Steve Witkoff's son, Zach, is its CEO of the World Liberty Financial. And so you have the fact that Trump and his family members own a very significant chunk of World Liberty. Now, there are some other issues involved because World Liberty has been involved with various foreign actors. Abu Dhabi is one example in which Abu Dhabi used World Liberty's, in this case, their stable coin, to invest in Binance, which is a crypto platform. And while we're talking about Binance, as a crypto company, pled guilty in 2023 to violating U.S. anti-money laundering laws and Iranian sanctions. Its co-founder, Changpeng, he's called just Cheng Zhao, anyway, Zhao, has pled guilty to that as well. But then remember, back in October, President Donald Trump pardoned him, even though he pled guilty to violating the Bank Secrecy Act. So you can start looking down the horizon here and then begin to recognize as well that the Trump family has been involved in critical minerals, which again is an important issue. We recognize that there is a need to develop our rare earth minerals in this country or in other countries other than China so that China cannot weaponize its dominance in rare earth. So I agree with that. But again, the Trump family sees an opportunity, and that's where you come to the second part of this statement by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, the Trump family and honest graft. Well, again, honest graft was a phrase that was used during Tammany Hall's particular construction and manipulation of elections. I love they put in parentheses, for Princeton history majors, Tammany Hall was the 19th century Democratic political machine. But anyway, we can go to then looking at Donald Trump Jr.'s venture capital firm at 1789 Capital, invested in Vulcan Elements 3 months before the company received a $620 million government loan. Then you have the investment banker Cantor Fitzgerald, who used to head Cantor Fitzgerald. Well, that would be the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. Now it's run by his sons, and he's been a financial advisor as well. And then the Trump administration also offered up $1.6 billion in financing for a project to develop some of the tungsten mines in Kazakhstan, which we were just talking about a minute ago. That firm is partly owned by Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., who invested in that company. As a matter of fact, the president of Kazakhstan came to the United States to get a photo of him with, of course, the president signing the deal in the White House. If you've listened to Point of View, you know that in the past we've interviewed a man by the name of Peter Schweitzer, who I think has been an equal opportunity grief giver. He, for example, wrote the book Clinton Cash and demonstrated how the Clintons, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, used the Clinton Foundation and others to channel all sorts of funds to them. He also wrote the book, and it's on my shelf, Secret Empires, which talks about what the Obama administration, then later the Biden administration used to channel funds. And again, you have to say, if we were looking at those issues with these Democratic presidents, will Peter Schweitzer look at what the Republican president, Donald Trump, is doing? And I think so. So let's end this with the editors of the Wall Street Journal saying, look, assuming all of this is legal, it's still an unseemly display of using the presidency for family profit. It's hard to believe that the Trump boys would be able to do the same deals if Dad was not in the Oval Office. The main difference, they say, between Hunter Biden's foreign dealings and the Trump projects is the Trumps are brazenly open about theirs. But there are some political costs for Republicans. If Democrats take control of the House or Senate this November, they will have a field day, say the editors of the Wall Street Journal, probing the Trump family deals. Charges of Republican corruption will resound through 2028, and this will feed the left's warfare and narrative that billionaire oligarchs are getting rich off of government. You know, it was probably fair to say that Trump, in the first 4 years of his presidency, lost money, if for no other reason because of the Russia collusion hoax and a variety of other things. When he was out of office, we've talked about the debanking of him and of Eric and of Donald, even of Melania, even of Barron, all of those individuals. And then, of course, even the attempt to try to prosecute him. So you can understand maybe the feeling that once we're back in office, the government owes us something. But if you haven't been paying attention, believe me, over the next few months, you're going to hear a lot more about what not only Donald Trump has been doing, but what Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Howard Lutnick, and others have been doing. And this is why I think this article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal was a very good and I think well-written summary of some of the issues that you'll be hearing about for some time. And maybe you heard about it first on Point of View. Those are the kind of stories we think need to be covered. That's why I covered it today. We'll come back with other stories right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, this weekend, talk about an issue making its way through Congress, and I'm not sure we'll necessarily do an action alert on it, but we might perhaps. It involves a little bit of an understanding of what's called reciprocity, the Second Amendment, and a few other issues, but maybe a good way to illustrate that is quite often I get to go to New England, and oftentimes we go to Vermont, and I go to Manchester, go to where Orvis is, and then eventually I'm going to New York where I'm speaking, sometimes at Word of Life, sometimes Camp of the Woods. One time I was just going to another camp, and I had people with me one time, and I said, now notice something very interesting. On this side here of Vermont, we have farmers, some dairy farmers and other ranchers and things like that, and these farmers here, they have access to all sorts of weapons, whether it's handguns, rifles, shotguns, everything, because in Vermont, this is a particular state that is probably much more open to Second Amendment issues, not having a lot of restrictions on various firearms. And over here, they pay lower taxes, and they have a lot more freedom when it comes to the Second Amendment. Okay, now we just go over the rise, and now we're in New York. The farms in Vermont and the farms in New York look virtually the same, but over on this side where the line is, these farmers have to pay a lot more in taxes. They have many more restrictions on their guns, if they have any at all, and it's only the difference between walking to this side of the street and that side of the street, or that part of the hill and the other part of the hill, and it illustrates again one of the issues that I've posted for you to read by our good friend John Lott, and that is he makes the very compelling argument that crossing a state line shouldn't cost you your right to self-defense. And he gives you some examples. He says, imagine a woman driving across state lines alone at night, fearful that her car might break down and leave her vulnerable. Or picture a truck driver hauling valuable cargo across the country. In states such as California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, and Oregon, 5 of the 10 states that refuse to recognize concealed handgun permits from other states, these travelers can find themselves defenseless. 9 other states either deny non-resident permits altogether or make them extremely difficult to obtain. And so that is, I think, why we are talking about the possibility of passing what is called a national concealed carry reciprocity. In other words, if you carry for a concealed and have a concealed license, say in the state of Texas, and then you go to Oregon or New York, two places I go to with some regularity, Illinois, also go there as well, not allowed, and I have to be very careful. So last week, President Donald Trump argued for the passage of a national concealed carry reciprocity. The legislation would allow anyone legally permitted to carry a concealed handgun in their home state to carry it across state lines, just as we, of course, can do with our driver's license. That would make some sense. Now, one of the things John Lott does in this piece, which I would encourage you to read if you're interested in Second Amendment issues, is he said much of the gun control debate centers on what he calls hypothetical risks. With reciprocity, we don't have to speculate. He says with 21.5 million concealed handgun permit holders in the United States, we already know how they behave. In addition, most Americans already benefit from reciprocity. The average state recognizes permits from 30 other states, allowing permit holders to travel legally with their firearms. So he then begins to talk about some of the issues. He says, for example, congressional opponents of reciprocity warned that permit holders would commit crimes, but cited no evidence to support their claim. He says the facts point in the opposite direction. Concealed handgun permit holders are extraordinarily law-abiding. And we know that. States, for example, revoke permits for firearm-related violations at rates measured in the thousands or even tens of thousands of a percent. So this is very rare where this takes place. In order to get a concealed handgun permit, you have to go through a background check. There are all sorts of things you need to go through. These are the kind of people, frankly, that you want to have as citizens in your particular state. He also points out that opponents have also claimed that national reciprocity would confuse travelers about which gun laws apply in each state and lead to more arrests. But reciprocity already exists around, as he said, most of the country, and there's no evidence to show that out-of-state permit holders create such problems. Again, these are arguments, but they're not really very good. Critics also argue, he says, that permit standards vary from state to state, but yet no evidence shows that states with less restrictive permitting systems experience higher permit revocation rates. In other words, where you pull them off because they have violated that particular opportunity there. If nothing else, he points out something which I was unaware of. Despite these fears, he says more than 86% of police chiefs and sheriffs support national reciprocity, and over 90% of rank and file officers support concealed carry laws. These officers, he says, see firsthand how concealed carry works in practice. They understand that police deter crime, but they also know that they usually arrive after crime has begun. Victims often must defend themselves first. Consistent with that experience, he says, the overwhelming weight of academic research finds that allowing law-abiding citizens to carry concealed handguns reduces crime. By the way, he doesn't just make those statements. There's links to each one of those, and if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can see that this particular article gives you a chance to, as you click on Learn More, all the necessary links. You can follow each one of the links to follow each one of the academic studies, some of which he's done and others which he cites, which are there the case. So he says again, with tens of millions of Americans legally carrying concealed handguns over many decades, if opponents could identify even, as he said, dozens of cases in which out-of-state permit holders created serious problems, their concerns would deserve careful consideration. They cannot. Such cases remain exceedingly rare. Americans do not need to guess whether these concerns are justified. We can see that they are not. Carrying a firearm provides a greater benefit to those who face the largest physical disadvantages. Who would those be? Women and the elderly. To those who face the highest risk of violent crime, including many poor black residents of high crime neighborhoods. He then goes on to, again, cite some of the research that you can see as well. Peer-reviewed research finds that allowing concealed carry reduces murder rates for both men and women. And here's the interesting part. The reduction for women, however, is 3 to 4 times larger than the reduction for men. It's pretty obvious if you think about this. Most women cannot overpower somebody who is larger and stronger, no matter how well trained they are in judo, karate, jiu-jitsu, whatever it might be. Men generally possess greater upper body strength and speed, and we've talked about this before. And so he points out that here the House will likely pass national reciprocity. Really, I think that's going to happen really soon, but it faces a more difficult challenge, a steeper challenge, he says, in the Senate, because you require 60 votes to actually end filibuster. And so there are some states which maybe need to think about this. 6 states represent 12 Democratic senators: Arizona, Georgia, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Virginia, which already recognize concealed handgun permits. So it is quite possible that even though they're Democratic senators, they may recognize what their own state has already allowed. But he ends by simply making a very obvious statement. Police play an indispensable role in public safety, but with 700,000 officers nationwide, they can not possibly protect 340 million Americans everywhere at once. So he says Congress should ensure that law-abiding Americans do not lose their ability to defend themselves simply by crossing a state line. So again, this article, it's about 4 pages long, has lots of references and links to research studies. It's something that you might want to check out. You might, as you are talking to candidates for Congress, in case this one has to be voted on next year, which is at least likely, find out where they stand on this issue. And I think it's an important one, and we have posted that for you to read on our website at pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought I, for just a few minutes, would talk about what's going on up there in Maine for a couple of reasons. We have an article that's coming out tomorrow. We'll get into it in more detail, but it's a wonderful piece in which Scott Jennings, who was on CNN, said, you guys are doing it again. And the doing it again is this. You have a situations, and they referred to this as the Democratic circus, but you can come to your own conclusion here, in which the party has decided to drop an individual from the ticket and replace that individual with someone that no one voted for. You might remember how that happened in 2024. Let's drop Joe Biden off the ticket and put Kamala Harris on. Nobody voted for her. Well, we have now, in the same situation in Maine, a situation which, of course, we have the story of Grand Plattner, who now the scandal has come out even further, and so the decision has been to drop him off the ticket and run someone else. And as somebody said the other day, this isn't the SAT, guys. You can't erase one answer and put in another. And I thought Scott Jennings' answer, and we'll get into that more tomorrow. But I just thought we would at least talk about what is going on, because Scott Jennings also went on CNN to point out that yes, he was vetted, and you knew this, and it was only in this now 11th hour of, well, I don't think he's going to do very well because the polling's going in the wrong direction, that all of a sudden we pull out some more of the scandals. But just in case you aren't aware, you have now Jenny Ransicott, I talked about this yesterday, accusing him of breaking into her home and raping her. And, of course, the argument comes after we've had so many other individuals that have come forward. Here's the short list. Gary Bauer provided it, and I thought it was a good list as well. You have had, for example, the Nazi tattoo that he had. Multiple women said that he physically mistreated them. He has himself referred to himself as a communist, although that's not necessarily a deal breaker for some of the people that might have voted for him. He has mocked wounded veterans. He has smeared police officers, to put it mildly. He has referred to people living in the rural areas and white Americans as racist and stupid. And he has actually done a profile on what social media platform, I won't even give it its name, has been called a predator's paradise. He also mocked Mary, the mother of Jesus, and I won't use the phrase he used there. He, of course, even lied about his working class background. With all that, which we already knew, not the least of which is an individual that came to before the New York Times and expressed some of this, but was dismissed because, well, she's a conservative. Now, all of a sudden, a liberal comes forward, and that's all, again, an issue. But look at the people that were endorsing him that have now withdrawn their endorsement. That would be the Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer. That would be Senator Bernie Sanders. Be Senator Elizabeth Warren. That would be Governor J.B. Pritzker. That would be Representative Ro Khanna. Of course, be New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani. Even the social media influencer Hassan Piker has withdrawn, I believe, his endorsement here as well. And so they're looking for now another candidate. And you would think this is out of the Babylon Bee, but Gary Bauer documented this. One of the possible candidates they decided not to use because he's hit a woman on the head with a bottle. Can't we find anyone better? And I think the other part of this is to recognize how eager many of the Democratic leaders were to get power and overlook so much. Now, are there times when Republicans have done that? Sure. Not as often. You can see a lot of individuals that once the scandal erupts in the New York Times or the Washington Post, they are gone. And there are people speaking out against them almost instantaneously. Can I find exceptions? Yes. But the general rule has been, especially with some of these moral issues, that those individuals get eliminated immediately. We have a race right now in the Senate, and I'll get to that another day, in terms of some of the reaction, both pro and con in that regard. But if you think that this is, as some people have wanted to say, a one-off, Gary Bauer reminds us that this is not an oddity. The news broke last year when a Democratic candidate for the Attorney General in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, who now is the Attorney General, fantasized about conservative children dying in their mother's arms in order to teach conservatives a lesson. And so we are seeing these kinds of things happening, and character has always been an issue in campaigns, and yet the issue of character was something that many of the leaders in the Democratic Party were willing to turn a blind eye to, and yet I think is going to be a bigger issue in these midterms. We'll see whether or not Graham Plattner steps down. He's made a point, I think, if I'm correct, right, in which he says, I will step down if you can find a good candidate. Well, yes, you could probably find a better one than you. And there are just all sorts of other issues that are associated with Maine, but we will maybe devote those to another day, because even the former governor was a likely candidate but stepped down because of his popularity. And we'll just, again, get into those issues probably in some of our roundtable conversations, especially if he does step down and we look at the new candidate there as well. Just before I run out of time, let me again encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You can find out more about Todd Nettleton, about Voice of the Martyrs, about the Day of the Christian Martyr. We've also posted some of the articles that related to the rather significant rant by Zohran Mamdani, one by Cal Thomas, one by Victor Davis Hanson. Also a very good piece by Andy Kessler about different parties, same folly, as well as, of course, the one from the Wall Street Journal about the Trump family, and then, of course, one about crossing state lines and self-defense by John Lott. But just before we go, let me also mention, if you scroll down past those articles, which are under the what are called show materials, you'll see there's a place where you can, of course, give to Point of View, and if you would want to do so, I would encourage you to do so. You'll also find our viewpoints section on the website, and one of those today is about my article on Bible passages. It's based, again, on a very good question that was asked by the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Do Bible passages belong in English class? And they gave some great examples, which I point you to. 23rd Psalm, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, quoted by everyone from Nelson Mandela to a recent rapper. How about Ecclesiastes? To everything there's a season, a time to be born, a time to die, I should say. And again, this passage, which young people might think came from a song, actually is found in the Bible. Love is patient, love is kind, 1 Corinthians 13. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The editors point out you can find these comments in Walt Whitman, Charles Dickens, Robert Frost, George Orwell, and my argument is very clear. At a time when we have the highest level of biblical illiteracy, doesn't it at least make sense to point out to some of the students studying English that these passages that they're reading came from the Bible? And that's what the Texas State Board decided. But the vote was a lot closer than I think it needed to be. And to just illustrate again why you need to pay attention to even the people running for school board or for the State Board of Education. As always, want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Hope you join us tomorrow right here on Point of View. We'll see you then.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.